Hi everybody, Adam Steele from Hot Pole Studios here, and today we're talking about a monitor controller that's come out from Audient. This is the Nero. I've been trying to make this video for a while now, several weeks, and it's been kind of difficult trying to think of the right things to say about it. But I am very impressed, so I'm going to talk about a lot of what this little thing can do. So I tried for quite a while to think of a way to do some sort of practical demonstration of the Nero on camera, and eventually I kind of gave up and realised that what this is not something that you can actually demo in a video really, because the long and short of it is that a device like this, a monitor controller, makes your speakers louder and quieter with a volume knob, allows you to choose between which speakers you're using, and allows you to pick different inputs and send them to different outputs. Now, there are other products on the market that do some of this, but I'll talk about this again at the end. There are none that I found that do exactly what the Nero does. So what does it do? Let's just break it down briefly. It's got 4 different inputs. It's got 3 different sets of stereo outputs, a subwoofer out, and it's got 4 headphone amps in there as well. Not just 4 channels of headphone amp, but they're all completely separate from each other. They can have different inputs assigned to them. They can then have different, you can have the talkback that's inbuilt, either going to each set of headphones or not, depending on your choice. This unit is all about choice, and I thought that a lot of this was absolutely brilliant in that regard. What I want a monitor controller for is to have it set exactly how I like it, so that at any given point I can choose to switch from one set of speakers to another. I'm not then having to mess about adjusting anything. If I'm sending some to a headphone out, again, I'm not spending ages messing around trying to make sure that everything's right. And that's where the Nero really comes into its own. So it's got 2 balanced sets of stereo inputs, source 1 and 2. It's also got a Q input, which actually makes it a 3rd set of balanced inputs. And then it's got an aux input, which can either be phono RCA jacks. It can be a 3.5mm mini jack, which I thought was kind of cool, which means if someone brings in a phone with an aux cable, then without you having to completely change all the routing in your studio, then you can go, let's hear what's on your phone, because quite often an artist will have a demo and they just want you to hear it. They don't necessarily need it transferring anywhere, and you can really save yourself time by just getting an aux cable into the phone and going, click, let's have a listen, volume up, aux input, let's have a listen, and do that. That aux input does share the digital input, which is SPDIF. It's either coax or optical, so whatever connection you've got, they both work. And it supports stereo audio up to 192 kilohertz. So no matter what sample rate your digital stuff is working at, that will connect here. And that's all on the Alt input. So you use this button to choose whichever input you want. And I can actually hear an audible click when I change where the relays are physically changing connections. And that, I think, is great. And that's something that's worth talking about, is any of these buttons that change the inputs or the outputs, when I press them, I hear a very definite click. And it's not a button click. It's a different kind of click. It's a relay click, which means rather than everything being connected in some sort of computerized system trying to make the best out of the sound, it's all physically connected. And the relays physically connect one piece to the next. And that really does go a long way to making sure the audio quality is maintained throughout. Something that's worth talking about straight off the bat is the obvious thing that as you turn up and down the volume on your input and output, let's just say we're using the main output for now, the volume of the left and right channels goes up and down perfectly together. That might sound really obvious, but on some of the cheaper controllers, like I've got an old TC Electronic Level Pilot here that I used for a while, and I've since discarded it. The only reason I didn't throw it in the bin is in case I wanted to talk about it on videos like this, because I found that with analog devices like this, over time, the contacts get dirty, which means that the amount of signal coming through is either not right or the level's not quite perfect on one side. And for the longest time, that would really mess with me and confuse my confidence in the stereo image. Sometimes I'd pan things slightly off, and it would turn out it was entirely that thing's fault. So I got rid of it, got rid of that problem. But the way this works, it's a stepped volume. Even though there's no physical stepping in the control on the knob, it's stepped input levels so that you get a consistent level on both sides, and that stereo image cannot be messed with, which I thought was really quite useful there. Aside from the main output here, it's got two alternate outputs, which are both balanced TRS on the back, as is the main output. They're all TRS, which does save some space, but it's functionally the same as using XLR contacts because it's all balanced audio. It's just a smaller connector, but you know, if you call them stereo jacks, the ones that have got two pieces and then a ground, that's TRS, that's balanced, and that means that the cables aren't going to pick up noise along the way, either from the interface or from whatever, or to the speakers. They're not going to pick up any extra noise because balanced cables, that's the design, that's what they do. There's also the subwoofer output, which is a mono sub output, which for me is a little annoying, but I'm a real edge case there. Most people who have a subwoofer in a studio will have a mono one. Now, the sub output is switchable separately from the inputs here, which again is quite useful because it means that if you switch from your main speakers to a different set of speakers, you can then choose to still use that sub with the second set of speakers or not, depending on your personal preferences. There are 3 sets of outputs, which seems excessive at first, but then the more you think about it, that can become quite useful. Just to talk about these outputs for a minute, these all, you can choose to have the subwoofer on. If I hold down the button for, say, the main input, that'll start flashing. I can then choose to have the sub on there, and then click the main to stop flashing, and now every time I click the main output, the sub will be on by default. So if you've got a particular setup where you like it by default, then you can have that on or not. You can do that with the alt outputs as well. So you can then have them all 3 with the sub or none with the sub by default, but that doesn't stop you putting it on manually. So you can use it as a reference and not the rest of the time if that's how you choose to work. Each of these outputs, you can also make them mono with a mono button. And let's say you've got something like an Auratone speaker as on your third output, again, just maybe, on your third output you've got an Auratone speaker. So if I hold down the alt till it's flashing and then put the mono on, then if I go out of that by hitting the alt 2 again, that output is now always going to be in mono. Again, I can disable that, but then if you use just one output from alt 2, you could then have a mono speaker in the middle, and you click that output, and that automatically just switches to mono on that channel. Again, time savers, because I can go main outputs with the sub, alternate output, which let's say I don't want the sub with that, and then secondary output is a mono right in the middle, which a lot of studios are now like to work like that. So you've got, you know, main full range monitors, something like NS10s, and then an Auratone or some other Dropbox mono speaker in the middle. So I can then go. And if I change my mind with the setup at any time, it took me almost no time at all to then change those defaults so I can flick back and forward between something else. Aside from the mono, we can get really clever here with polarity. So there's a polarity button, and what that does on its own will flip the polarity of the left channel. So you can check that if you've got any phase issues going on, you can quickly flip the phase of one side. If it sounds better, you probably do have some phase issues going on, and you can flip the polarity back and fix that. To go one further, if I was to mono, say my alternate output, so that both speakers have got the same thing coming on, not only is that mono, that's considered the mid channel in a mid-side array. If I press the polarity button whilst we're in mono, that flips the left channel, which then you still get a mono signal, but you're hearing the sides rather than the mid. So by being in mono, I can then go mid, side, and just monitor the mid-side stuff without having to go absolutely crazy with anything in the computer. I can just do mid-side monitoring right there. Now let's say that your main speakers, you've got the level set how you like them, but then your next set of speakers, let's say they're NS10s with a power amp, you've got that power amp calibrated, and it turns out that those speakers are a little quieter or maybe a little louder than your main outputs. That's really annoying, so rather than going and trying to completely recalibrate that other set of monitors, we can do that on here, and we can do it very quickly. So what we want to do is hold down that say Alt 1, so that that's flashing, and you can do that with the main or Alt 2. And then once that's flashing, we can then change the volume on the main rotary encoder until that volume is right, and then untick the Alt 1, and then that will stick at that much extra volume compared to the, say, your other sets of speakers. Or you can go down and you can have it quieter, you can do both there. So then you've got a level calibration where you've not had to go and change anything on any of your equipment other than here. Now the dim is quite useful as well. There's dim and cut. Cut does exactly what it says. It's a mute button. It just stops everything coming out of your outputs. But the dim takes it down by a certain level, and that level is defined by you. Again, a lot of these buttons, if you hold them down until they start blinking, you can then change things. If I hold down the dim, I can then take the amount that the volume is being dipped by, and I can change it. Personally, I like my dim to be really quite dramatic. I think by default they said in the manual it's 15 dB of dim. I like it more like 20 or 25 dB. I like to really bring the volume down, especially in this studio. If there's a band, say we've got a drummer tracking in the live room, his take's going well, but I want to talk to someone in the control room, I like to dim so it really takes the level down without disturbing the drummer or the take or anything, and then I can have a conversation at a reasonable level, but then I can undim it and still have quite loud tracking so that what I'm hearing reflects that kind of power and whatever it may be. So I press dim, I select how much I want it dimmed by, press that again, and that's then set so that whenever I hit the dim button, it dims it by that amount. So let's say you're happy with all your settings now. What you do is you hold down two of the outputs together until all the lights flash and stop flashing. Doesn't take long. That's all now saved, which means that if I turn it off and then turn it back on again, all those settings are now kept. If I hadn't saved it, which can be quite useful, I can do things that are session relevant and then want to turn it off and on again and back to how I was. So you're not then stuck with every decision you've made on a session unless you then decide, right, this is perfect now, save. That can be quite useful if you're using this in, say, a guest setup where you want people to be able to configure things for themselves but not necessarily be permanent, so that next time you come to your setup it's back to how you like it. I think that's quite useful there. Not really talked about the Talkback mic or the headphones yet. So the headphones, there are 4 different outputs, and each one, they are loud and they are very clear. I think it said it's something like 0.009% THD, total harmonic distortion, which is very low, which means they're very, very clear headphone outputs, which is great. And I tried my Sennheiser 650s with them and they got fairly loud, not as loud as like a dedicated headphone amp would do, but then the with anything other than something like Sennheiser 650s, with something with a more reasonable impedance, where 650s have got 600 ohm load, which means that you need to drive them really hard. Anything that's more reasonable, like Sony tracking headphones, Bayer DT100, something like that, which have got a much lower impedance, they put out something like 100 milliwatts, which is definitely enough to send you deaf. Drummers might want that, I don't know, hey. But the fact that you can choose different inputs per headphone section here really opens up another world of possibilities for me and makes this not just a monitor controller. What I might want to do, the way that I like to work in the studio, I only have one input. So for me, the input section would have been largely redundant because in my studio, we have separate headphone amps and outputs and all that kind of thing. But if I didn't have all of that, I could say have input source 2 going to headphone 2. I could have the alt input from the digital going to headphone 3, and I could have the Q input going to headphone 4. I'm just making this up as I go along, but then that's 4 completely independent headphone mixes. And by hitting the source button, then I get to choose which one of those it is. Comes up green, and the Talkback, which I'll now talk about, you can choose to either have that in each set of headphones or not. The Talkback comes up red for each headphone output that you want that to go to. Again, that's useful for someone like me, because if I'm using headphone 1 in here to get a kind of a headphone monitor, I don't want to be hearing the Talkback. The guys with the other headphone outputs, they probably want to hear the Talkback, so I can talk to them, but I don't. Also, the Talkback mic that's internal, that works perfectly well. The gain is quite, it goes high. Let's put it that way. You can have it so that you can crank the Talkback gain. It's not particularly noisy, and that means that you can have someone at the back of the studio control room who shouts not very loudly, and it comes through to the headphone outputs perfectly fine. Or you can, using the XLR input on the back, choose an external microphone, and it's also got a 48 volt phantom power, so if for some reason you want a condenser mic to be your studio talkback, that option's there without any extra hardware, any preamp or any of that kind of jazz. That's all built in. So, the Nero does a lot. And like I said at the start of the video, it's very difficult to show you guys the audio quality that you get from it. But I spent quite a while setting all this up myself off camera, gave this an extensive test, and in my opinion, this doesn't colour the sound, which for me is everything that I could possibly ask for out of a monitor controller. Audient are well known for their preamps in their big mixing desks and in their interfaces, and they sound quite clean if you push them. They've got a nice character, but this is a different product entirely, and this is something that I think is quite new for Audient, where it doesn't have much of a character, it doesn't have much of a sound, but it's not supposed to. It's supposed to be completely transparent and just there to be used when you need it, without you noticing that it's affecting anything, and being very, very fast to use. Now, just quickly, let's talk about the price. This is £399-ish. It'll be roughly the same in dollars, roughly the same in euros as well. And that's a fair amount of money for a monitor controller. There are cheaper alternatives, but I don't necessarily know if that means that there are better alternatives, because it depends entirely on what you want. I had a bit of a look around to see what the competition was. So at a much lower price, there is something like the TC Level Pilot, but I wouldn't recommend that to anybody having used it, because it's basically just an analog attenuator that's not even very good and fails very quickly and has none of these features. Behringer have made kind of a cheap version. Of course they have, that's what Behringer do. That seemed kind of functional, but very, very flimsy, where this weighs an absolute ton. I can hear the relays in it. This is solid stuff. This is really not going to break on you. The volume knob's weighty. Everything's heavy and chunky and not going to break, which is a lot of what you pay for. And then there's the functionality, where I looked at things like, say, the Mackie Big Knob Studio Plus is a new one from Mackie. That's a little cheaper than this at 250 quid. It doesn't have all the separate headphone outputs with the different choices. It didn't seem to be very intuitive in terms of selecting things like having the sub on all the time with one channel or having mono permanently on, or that kind of thing just wasn't that intuitive by the look of it. And something that I've noticed on every other monitor controller in this price range, they've all got USB input, and I really find that quite irritating. I find that to be kind of a feature that's lost on the kind of people who are going to buy a monitor controller. If you're going to buy something like this, you've probably already got a high-class interface with several outputs. Why else would you need something like this? And then the multiple outputs is because you've got the high-quality audio coming from an interface, which already has all the microphone preamps attached, which is what you want in your studio. Why would you then want to try and use a USB input and output, which then your Mac or PC is not going to want to use, whilst it's also using a professional preamp and interface set? Because then you get device aggregation issues that can cause all sorts of problems. So it seems like something that's on there because apparently USB is cool and that's what you do right now. And you've got all these things. Oh, it's an interface. No, it's not an interface. And those kind of things are trying to be something that I don't think is what people need. At least not what most engineers are going to end up needing in their separate circumstances. There will be a few, but for me, this goes hand in hand with something like the Audient ID44, which has several outputs. It's got the coax and optical and all that kind of wonderful stuff. And more importantly, it's kind of perfectly paired, sound-wise, quality-wise. And then you go on to your several sets of speakers. All your headphone outputs can then be routed for your musicians, but then they can also have the Talkback integrated, which you don't get on any interface that I know of right now. There's so much to do. And there are things that have this level of quality and these kind of features, but then we're looking at stuff like the Dangerous Music D-Box and that kind of range, and that's at the kind of £2,000 mark. That's a 5-fold increase in price, roughly. That, if you need the next step up from this, you are looking at the kind of money that makes me go pale, because that's a lot of money for a monitor controller. So this, for me, in its price range, should be a game changer. And so I wholeheartedly recommend it. It's the kind of thing where if this had come out a couple of years ago, this would be sat on that desk and would not be going back. The only reason that I'll be sending this back to Audient, thank you to Audient for the lend of this for the review, by the way, is because I spent a long time making quite a janky custom build that's now what I need, but is quite modular, it's piecemeal, it's been done in quite a kind of janky way. If I hadn't already had to spend a lot of time and hassle doing that, this would be what I would have got. Absolutely, 100%. And I'm still half tempted to rip out the whole system back there and start again and throw one of these in there, because it's so simple. Once it's set up, you can go mains with sub, alternate speaker, alternate mono speaker. Let's check the mono, let's check the sides. Click, 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 click. Make sure all the headphone outputs are done, all that kind of thing. It's so simple. I can't say much more about it, so thank you, Audient, and thank you everybody for watching. I hope you found this useful. If you have found this useful, then thank you again. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, because we do more gear reviews like this. We do tutorials on digital audio workstations. We do guitar noises of different amps, different pedals, different tubes, different all sorts of stuff. That's what we do here. We're quite technical and quite nerdy, as you can probably tell from this video. And if you really, really like what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon, because that's a way that helps us to keep the lights on, because when we're not with studio clients, we're doing this, and that's the only way to really pay the bills. And we really, really appreciate everybody that already helps us on Patreon. And you get early access to the videos, you get direct connections to me and the team, and you get my eternal gratitude. So thank you very much, everybody, once more. I'm Adam Steele, and we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.